Maya stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, her sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. The building felt massive around her, with its high ceilings and echoing hallways that seemed to swallow every sound. She'd been here dozens of times before, but today felt different somehow. Today she was here to watch something that mattered. She pulled her hood down and adjusted her backpack straps, glancing around at the people rushing past her in expensive suits and shiny shoes. Everyone looked so serious, so important. Maya had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, but in places like this, they seemed to matter more than anywhere else. The elevator ride to the third floor felt like it took forever. Maya checked her phone. 9:15 a.m. She was cutting it close, but she'd make it in time for the opening statements. The case she'd come to observe was Johnson versus Metropolitan Housing Authority, and it was exactly the kind of case that kept her up at night, reading legal documents by the light of her laptop screen. When the elevator doors opened, Maya could already hear the murmur of voices coming from courtroom 3B. She walked quickly down the hallway, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. This wasn't just any notebook. It was filled with months of research, case studies, and legal precedents that most people would need years of law school to understand. The courtroom was already half full when Maya slipped inside. She found a seat in the back gallery, trying to make herself invisible among the scattered observers. Some looked like journalists. Others might have been law students or curious citizens. Maya fell somewhere in between all of them, which was exactly how she liked it. Judge Harrison entered from his chambers and the entire room rose to their feet. Maya studied his face as he settled into his chair behind the bench. She'd researched him too, of course. 30 years on the bench, appointed by a governor who'd promised to be tough on crime and light on what he called frivolous lawsuits. Harrison had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for what he considered time wasting. The case began, and Maya immediately pulled out her pen. The plaintiff was Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in her 60s who'd been denied housing at 3 different apartment complexes in the past year. Each time she'd been told the same thing, that her application didn't meet their standards. But Maya had done her homework. She knew that Mrs. Rodriguez had excellent credit, steady income, and spotless references. She also knew that all 3 complexes had approved applications from people with worse qualifications, people who just happened to have different last names. As the plaintiff's attorney began his opening statement, Maya could already see the problems. He was nervous, stumbling over basic legal terms, and worst of all, he wasn't telling the story in a way that would connect with the judge or jury. Maya bit her lip and kept writing, documenting every missed opportunity and weak argument. The defense attorney was sharp, polished, and clearly expensive. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about being judged by his appearance or background. Maya watched him dismiss Mrs. Rodriguez's claims as unfortunate misunderstandings and coincidental timing. It made her stomach turn. During the first recess, Maya noticed Mrs. Rodriguez sitting alone on a bench outside the courtroom. Her attorney was on his phone, pacing back and forth, looking stressed and overwhelmed. Maya hesitated for a moment, then walked over to where the attorney was standing. "Excuse me," she said quietly, waiting for him to finish his call. The attorney, whose name was David Chen, looked at her with tired eyes. "Yes?" "I've been following this case," Maya said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I noticed you didn't mention the Fair Housing Act violation in your opening. There's a specific precedent from the Ninth Circuit that could really help your case." David blinked, looking confused. "I'm sorry. Who are you exactly?" "Just someone. Who cares about this case?" Maya replied. "But there's a decision from Martinez versus Sunset Properties that's almost identical to what happened to Mrs. Rodriguez. If you can establish a pattern of discriminatory practices, you might be able to get punitive damages, not just compensatory." David stared at her for a long moment. Maya could see him trying to process what she'd just said. She pulled out her notebook and quickly wrote down the case citation, tearing out the page and handing it to him. "Look it up during lunch break," she suggested. "It might change everything." That's when Maya noticed Judge Harrison watching them from across the hallway. His expression was not friendly. He'd clearly seen their conversation, and from the way his eyebrows were drawn together, he didn't approve of whatever he thought was happening. Maya quickly said goodbye to David and headed back toward the courtroom. But Judge Harrison's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Young lady," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that adults used when they were about to lecture someone much younger. "Could you come here for a moment?" Maya's heart started beating faster, but she walked over to where the judge was standing. Up close, he seemed even more imposing than he had from the gallery. His gray hair was perfectly styled, and his black robe made him look like some kind of authority figure from another century. "What exactly were you discussing with Mr. Chen?" "Just now," Judge Harrison asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "I was just offering some information that might be helpful to his case, Your Honor," Maya replied respectfully. "Information?" The judge's voice rose slightly. "And what kind of information would someone like you have that would be helpful in my courtroom?" Maya felt the familiar sting of that phrase. Someone like you. She'd heard it her whole life, usually right before someone explained why she couldn't do something, shouldn't try something, or didn't belong somewhere. "I've been researching housing discrimination cases," Maya said calmly. "I noticed some legal precedents that might apply to this situation." Judge Harrison let out a short laugh that didn't sound amused at all. "Legal precedents? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Or are you just repeating things you heard on television?" Other people in the hallway were starting to notice their conversation. Maya could feel their eyes on her, and she knew what they were seeing. A young, black woman in a hoodie and jeans being questioned by a judge in front of a courthouse. She'd learned long ago that in situations like this, staying calm and respectful was her best defense. "I understand legal precedents, Your Honor," Maya said quietly. "I was just trying to help ensure that Mrs. Rodriguez gets fair representation." "Fair representation," Judge Harrison repeated slowly, as if he was tasting the words. "Let me ask you something, young lady. How old are you?" 19, Your Honor." 19. "And where exactly did you learn about legal precedents? Are you in college?" Maya hesitated. This was always the tricky part. The truth was complicated, and most people didn't believe it anyway. "I've studied law extensively," she said finally. "Studied law extensively," the judge repeated, his tone growing more skeptical by the second. "At 19, I see. And where exactly have you been studying law extensively?" The way he said it made it clear he expected her to name some community college or online program, something he could easily dismiss. Maya could feel the weight of his assumptions pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. "I prefer not to discuss my educational background right now, Your Honor," Maya said. "I was just trying to help with the case." Judge Harrison's expression darkened. "You prefer not to discuss it? How convenient." He looked around at the small crowd that had gathered to watch their exchange. "Let me make something very clear to you, young lady. This is a court of law, not a public library where you can come and play pretend lawyer. If you want to help people, maybe you should focus on finishing your education first." Maya felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice level. "I understand, Your Honor. I was just observing the proceedings." "Observing," Judge Harrison said. "Right. Well, when court resumes, I expect you to observe quietly from the gallery. No more legal advice, no more disruptions. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor." As Maya walked back toward the courtroom, she could hear whispers following her. She knew what people were thinking, that she was just another young person who'd gotten too big for her britches, someone who needed to be put in her place. If only they knew the truth. If only they knew that in her backpack, alongside her notebook, full of case law, she carried a law degree from one of the most prestigious universities in the country. If only they knew that she'd already passed the bar exam and was currently working on cases that would affect thousands of people. But Maya had learned patience. She'd learned that sometimes the best strategy was to let people underestimate you. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was wait for the right moment to show them exactly who you really were. As she settled back into her seat in the gallery, Maya opened her notebook to a fresh page. She had a feeling this day was far from over, and she wanted to document every single thing that happened next. When court resumed after lunch, Maya could feel the tension in the air. Judge Harrison's eyes found her immediately as she took her seat in the gallery, and she knew he hadn't forgotten their earlier conversation. She tried to focus on her notebook, pretending to review her notes, but she could sense his disapproval from across the room. The afternoon session wasn't going well for Mrs. Rodriguez. Her attorney seemed even more flustered than before, despite Maya's earlier advice about the legal precedent. He kept stumbling over his words, and Maya watched with growing frustration as he missed opportunity after opportunity to strengthen his client's case. During a brief sidebar between the attorneys and the judge, Maya noticed Mrs. Rodriguez looking back at her with hopeful eyes. The older woman had clearly seen their conversation during the break and seemed to understand that Maya genuinely cared about the outcome of her case. Maya gave her a small, encouraging smile, trying to convey that she was still rooting for her, but Judge Harrison noticed the exchange too. "Counselor Chen," the judge said as the sidebar ended, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. "I need to address something before we continue." David Chen looked confused as he returned to his table. "Yes, Your Honor? It's come to my attention that someone in this courtroom has been offering you unsolicited legal advice," Judge Harrison continued, his gaze moving deliberately to Maya. "I want to make it absolutely clear that such behavior is inappropriate and will not be tolerated in my courtroom." Maya felt every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew that any reaction would only make things worse. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, clearly enjoying having an audience, "I think this presents an excellent teaching moment about the importance of proper legal education and professional conduct." He stepped down from his bench, something Maya had never seen a judge do during active proceedings. The action made the entire courtroom feel smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more uncomfortable. "Young lady," he said, addressing Maya directly, while everyone watched. "Please stand up." Maya's heart hammered in her chest, but she complied. Standing made her feel even more exposed, like a student being called out in front of the entire class for cheating on a test. "Now, since you seem to think you're qualified to offer legal counsel," Judge Harrison said, his tone dripping with condescension, "why don't you share with everyone exactly what makes you think you understand the complexities of housing discrimination law?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya knew this was a trap, but she also knew that staying silent would be seen as an admission of ignorance. "Your Honor, I was simply trying to help ensure that Mrs. Rodriguez receives adequate representation," Maya said quietly. "Adequate representation," Judge Harrison repeated slowly, as if he was explaining something to a child. "And you determined that Mr. Chen's representation was inadequate, based on your extensive legal training?" Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Maya could see that some of the attorneys present looked embarrassed by what they were witnessing, but no one was brave enough to speak up. "I noticed some missed opportunities in the legal strategy," Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Judge Harrison laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Missed opportunities, legal strategy. You're using very impressive words for someone so young. Tell me, do you even know what burden of proof means?" Maya felt a flash of anger at the patronizing tone, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Yes, Your Honor. In a civil case like this one, the burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence, meaning the plaintiff must show that it's more likely than not that discrimination occurred." Judge Harrison's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Lucky guess. How about standing? Do you know what legal standing means?" "Legal standing refers to the right of a party to bring a lawsuit," Maya answered. "The plaintiff must have suffered an actual injury that can be addressed by the court." The judge's expression darkened. He clearly hadn't expected her to know the answers, and Maya could see him scrambling to regain control of the situation. "Anyone can memorize definitions," he said dismissively. "But the law isn't about memorization. It's about understanding, experience, and proper training. How many years of law school have you completed?" Maya hesitated. This was the question she'd been dreading. Your Honor, I'd prefer to focus on Mrs. Rodriguez's case rather than my personal background. I'm sure you would, Judge Harrison said, with a knowing smirk. Because we both know the answer is 0, don't we? You haven't completed any years of law school because you're barely out of high school yourself. The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the uncomfortable drama unfolding before her. Your Honor, David Chen finally found his voice. Perhaps we could return to the case at hand? Judge Harrison held up a hand to silence him. No, Mr. Chen, I think this is important. We have a young person here who thinks she can waltz into my courtroom and play lawyer without any qualifications whatsoever. This is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines the integrity of our legal system. He turned back to Maya, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. Do you understand that real people's lives are affected by what happens in this courtroom? This isn't a game or a television show. Mrs. Rodriguez deserves qualified representation, not advice from someone who learned about law from watching courtroom dramas. Maya bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. Everything in her wanted to defend herself, to explain exactly how qualified she was. But she also understood that this moment was bigger than just her pride. Judge Harrison was using her as an example, and anything she said would only provide more ammunition. Furthermore, the judge continued, clearly warming to his theme, your presence here raises serious questions about your priorities. Shouldn't someone your age be in school? Shouldn't you be focusing on your own education instead of disrupting legal proceedings? Maya could feel tears of frustration building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of all these people, and definitely not in front of Judge Harrison. I'm trying to do the right thing, she said quietly. The right thing. Judge Harrison's voice rose sharply. The right thing would be to recognize your limitations and leave the legal work to qualified professionals. The right thing would be to show respect for this institution and the people who have dedicated their lives to understanding it. He gestured broadly at the courtroom around them. Do you see these lawyers? They spent years studying, years taking exams, years learning from experienced mentors. They earned the right to practice law through hard work and dedication. You can't just decide you want to be a lawyer because you read a few articles online or watch some legal documentaries. Maya felt smaller with each word. She could see the pity in some people's eyes, the disgust in others. A few looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but no one was willing to stand up for her. Your Honor, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up, suddenly, her accented voice cutting through the tension. The young lady was just trying to help. Judge Harrison turned to her with barely concealed irritation. Mrs. Rodriguez, while I appreciate your desire to defend this young woman, you should understand that accepting legal advice from unqualified individuals could actually harm your case. He turned back to Maya one final time. I want you to understand something very clearly. This courtroom operates on rules, procedures, and laws that take years to master. It's not a place for amateur hour or good intentions. If you want to help people, there are appropriate ways to do that. Volunteer at a community center, tutor younger students, but leave the legal work to the professionals. Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the mixture of embarrassment, pity, and judgment that seemed to press down on her from all sides. Now, Judge Harrison said, returning to his bench with obvious satisfaction, I trust we won't have any more disruptions. This court is in the business of justice, not charity cases or misguided activism. As the proceedings resumed, Maya sank back into her seat, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her notebook. She'd never felt so humiliated in her entire life. But underneath the embarrassment and anger, something else was building. A determination that Judge Harrison had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and Maya was starting to think it was time he found out. Maya sat in stunned silence for the next 30 minutes, watching as Mrs. Rodriguez's case slowly fell apart before her eyes. David Chen was making mistake after mistake, and Judge Harrison seemed almost pleased with how poorly things were going. Every few minutes the judge would glance in Maya's direction with a satisfied smirk, as if to remind her of her place. But Maya's mind was racing. She could see exactly what was happening, and more importantly, she could see exactly how to fix it. The defense attorney was using a procedural argument that Maya knew had been overturned by recent case law. David Chen either didn't know about the newer ruling or was too flustered to remember it. Either way, Mrs. Rodriguez was about to lose her case because of a legal technicality that shouldn't even apply. Maya gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She watched as the defense attorney presented documents that she knew violated the Fair Housing Act in 3 different ways. She listened as he quoted a Supreme Court decision from 1978 that had been partially overturned by a 2019 ruling that directly supported Mrs. Rodriguez's position. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. This was about justice, and Maya could see it slipping away with every passing minute. The breaking point came when the defense attorney stood up and made a motion to dismiss the entire case. "Your Honor," he said with confidence, "the plaintiff has failed to establish a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. The evidence shows nothing more than unfortunate coincidences and poor timing." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I'm inclined to agree, Counselor. Mr. Chen, do you have any response to this motion?" David Chen looked like a deer caught in headlights. He shuffled through his papers frantically, clearly searching for something that could save his client's case. Maya could see Mrs. Rodriguez's face from where she sat, and the older woman looked like she was about to cry. "Your Honor," David stammered, "I believe, that is, we contend that—" "Take your time, Counselor," Judge Harrison said, but his tone suggested that time was exactly what David didn't have. Maya couldn't take it anymore. Every instinct she'd developed over years of legal training was screaming at her to act. She thought about her grandmother, who had faced housing discrimination in the 1960s. She thought about all the people who were sitting in courtrooms right now, watching their cases fall apart because they didn't have adequate representation. Before she could talk herself out of it, Maya stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her racing heart. The entire courtroom turned to look at her. Judge Harrison's expression immediately darkened. "Sit down," he said sharply. "We've already discussed this. Your Honor, with respect, I believe there's a significant legal error being made here that could result in a miscarriage of justice." Judge Harrison's face turned red. "Young lady, I will not warn you again. Sit down immediately or I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Maya took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment where she either backed down and let injustice prevail, or she stood up for what she knew was right, regardless of the consequences. "Your Honor, the defense's motion to dismiss is based on the precedent set in Washington versus Metropolitan Housing Corporation from 1978. However, that precedent was significantly modified by the Supreme Court's decision in Torres versus Sunset Development in 2019. The courtroom went completely silent. Even Judge Harrison stopped mid-gesture, his mouth slightly open as if he'd been about to say something but forgot what it was. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The 2019 ruling specifically states that a pattern of discrimination can be established through statistical analysis of approval rates, even without direct evidence of discriminatory intent. Mrs. Rodriguez's situation fits this standard perfectly." David Chen was staring at her with his mouth open. The defense attorney looked confused and slightly panicked. But Maya wasn't done. "Furthermore," she continued, "the defense cited Johnson versus City Planning Commission to support their argument about burden of proof. But that case was overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2021 in the matter of Williams versus Harborview Apartments. The new standard clearly states that when statistical evidence shows a disparate impact on protected classes, the burden shifts to the defendant to prove their actions were based on legitimate, non-discriminatory factors." Judge Harrison had gone very still. Maya could see him trying to process what he was hearing, trying to reconcile the legal expertise he was witnessing with his assumptions about who she was. "Additionally," Maya pressed on, "the defense's claim that Mrs. Rodriguez failed to exhaust administrative remedies is incorrect. Under Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, as amended by the Fair Housing Act of 1988, private individuals can file civil suits without first completing the HUD complaint process, provided they do So within 2 years of the alleged discriminatory act, the defense attorney was frantically flipping through his notes now, clearly trying to verify what Maya was saying. David Chen looked like he was witnessing a miracle. Maya pulled out her notebook and began reading specific case citations. In Patterson versus Oak Creek Apartments 2020, the Fourth Circuit ruled that evidence of comparable applications being approved, while minority applications were denied, constitutes prima facie evidence of discrimination. Mrs. Rodriguez has documented evidence of at least 6 applications from less qualified candidates being approved during the same time periods when her applications were denied. Judge Harrison finally found his voice. How do you know all of this? Maya looked directly at him. Because I've spent the last 2 years researching housing discrimination cases, Your Honor. I've read every major court decision on this topic from the past decade. I've studied the legislative history of the Fair Housing Act and its amendments. I know this area of law better than most practicing attorneys. That's impossible, Judge Harrison said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. You're 19 years old. Age doesn't determine knowledge, Your Honor, Maya replied calmly. What matters is study, preparation, and understanding. Mrs. Rodriguez deserves to have her case heard on its merits, not dismissed because of outdated legal precedents that no longer apply. She turned to address the entire courtroom now, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. The evidence shows that Mrs. Rodriguez was denied housing at 3 separate properties, despite having superior qualifications compared to approved applicants. The properties all used identical language in their rejection letters, suggesting coordinated practices. The timing of the denials, all occurring within 48 hours of application submission, indicates cursory review rather than thorough evaluation. Maya looked back at Judge Harrison. Under current fair housing law, this constitutes a clear violation that warrants not just compensatory damages, but punitive damages as well. The defense's motion to dismiss should be denied, and this case should proceed to trial where Mrs. Rodriguez can present her full evidence. The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Maya could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She had just delivered a legal argument that would have impressed law professors at Harvard, and she had done it from memory, under pressure, in front of a hostile judge who had spent the afternoon trying to humiliate her. Judge Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was much quieter than before. Where did you learn all of this? Maya smiled slightly. That's a very good question, Your Honor, and I think it's time I gave you a complete answer. Maya reached into her backpack slowly, aware that every person in the courtroom was watching her every move. Her fingers found the leather folder she always carried with her, the one that contained documents she rarely had to show anyone. Today was different. Today, Judge Harrison had pushed her to a point where silence was no longer an option. Your Honor, Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. You asked where I learned all of this. You questioned my qualifications and suggested I was just playing pretend lawyer. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, her sneakers echoing in the absolute silence. Even the court reporter had stopped moving, caught up in the drama unfolding before her. The truth is, I graduated from Harvard Law School last year, Maya continued, pulling out her diploma and holding it up for everyone to see. At the age of 17, making me one of the youngest graduates in the school's history. Judge Harrison's face went completely white. The defense attorney dropped his pen. David Chen looked like he might faint. But Maya wasn't finished. I didn't just graduate, Your Honor. I graduated summa cum laude, which means I was in the top 5% of my class. I was also the editor of the Harvard Law Review, and I published 3 articles on civil rights law before I turned 18. She set her diploma on the defendant's table where everyone could see it, then pulled out another document. This is my bar exam results. I passed on my first attempt with a score in the 98th percentile. I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Massachusetts, and I'm currently waiting for my results from this state's bar exam, which I took 2 months ago. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Maya could hear fragments of conversations. Impossible. She's just a kid. How is this real? But she continued speaking, her voice cutting through the noise. For the past year, I've been working with the Civil Rights Legal Foundation, handling cases just like Mrs. Rodriguez's. I've successfully represented clients in 12 housing discrimination cases, winning 11 of them. The one I lost was overturned on appeal when we discovered the judge had financial ties to the defendant. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This can't be real. You're 19 years old. Maya smiled, but there was no joy in it. Your Honor, I started college when I was 13. I had already completed my undergraduate degree in political science and African American studies by the time most people graduate from high school. I was accepted to Harvard Law School at 15, but they asked me to wait 2 years before starting to make sure I was emotionally ready for the program. She pulled out more documents, letters of recommendation, awards, certificates of recognition. This is a letter from Professor Williams at Harvard, who supervised my thesis on discriminatory housing practices in urban America. This is an award I received from the Massachusetts Bar Association for my work on pro bono civil rights cases. And this, she held up a thick folder, contains documentation of every housing discrimination case I've worked on in the past 18 months. The defense attorney was frantically whispering to his assistant, probably asking her to look up Maya's claims on her phone. David Chen was staring at Maya like she had just revealed she could fly. I came to observe this case because I've been tracking housing discrimination patterns in this city for the past 6 months, Maya continued. Mrs. Rodriguez's situation is part of a larger pattern involving at least 7 different property management companies. I have statistical analysis, financial records, and testimony from 43 other victims who experienced similar treatment. Judge Harrison was struggling to process what he was hearing. But you look so young. You dress like a teenager? Maya finished for him. That's because I am a teenager, Your Honor. But being young doesn't make me less qualified. Being black doesn't make me less intelligent. And wearing casual clothes doesn't make my law degree any less real. She walked closer to the bench, her voice growing stronger with each word. When I was 14, I was already reading Supreme Court decisions for fun. When I was 15, I was writing legal briefs that professors used as examples for their graduate students. When I was 16, I was arguing cases in moot court competitions against students who were twice my age. Maya turned to address the entire courtroom now. I've dedicated my entire life to understanding the law, not because I had to, but because I believe in justice. I believe that people like Mrs. Rodriguez deserve the same opportunities as everyone else. I believe that the law should protect the vulnerable, not just the wealthy and well-connected. She looked back at Judge Harrison, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair. When you questioned my qualifications earlier, when you suggested I should be in school instead of playing lawyer, you weren't just insulting me. You were demonstrating exactly the kind of bias that creates the need for civil rights law in the first place. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but Maya wasn't done. I could have stayed silent, she said. I could have let you humiliate me and walked away. But Mrs. Rodriguez deserves better than that. She deserves to have someone fight for her who actually understands the law, someone who has spent years studying these exact issues. Maya picked up her documents and organized them neatly. I'm not asking you to apologize to me, Your Honor. What I'm asking is that you give Mrs. Rodriguez the fair hearing she deserves. Judge her case on its merits, not on your assumptions about her attorney or anyone else in this courtroom. She turned to David Chen, who was still staring at her in amazement. Mr. Chen, if you're willing to accept my assistance, I'd like to help you present Mrs. Rodriguez's case properly. I can provide you with all the legal precedents, statistical analysis, and supporting documentation you need to win this case. David, I nodded vigorously, clearly overwhelmed but grateful. Judge Harrison finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse with shock. I don't understand. If you're really this qualified, why didn't you just say so from the beginning? Maya's expression grew sad. Because I shouldn't have to prove my worth to be treated with basic respect, Your Honor. Mrs. Rodriguez shouldn't have to prove she's worthy of fair housing. And I shouldn't have to show you my Harvard diploma just to be listened to when I'm trying to help someone. She gestured around the courtroom. How many other qualified people have you dismissed because they didn't look the way you expected them to look? How many cases have been decided unfairly because judges made assumptions instead of listening to the evidence? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Maya could see that her words had hit their target. Judge Harrison looked like a man who was seeing himself clearly for the first time in years, and he didn't like what he saw. Your Honor, Maya said gently, I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to embarrass you or challenge your authority. I'm here because I believe in the law, and I believe that justice should be blind to age, race, and appearance. Mrs. Rodriguez came to this court seeking fairness. That's all any of us really want. She walked back to her seat in the gallery, leaving her diploma on the table where everyone could see it. The question now is whether this court will give her the justice she deserves, or whether she'll become another victim of a system that judges people by how they look instead of who they really are. Judge Harrison stared at the diploma for a long moment, then looked at Maya, then at Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watching the proceedings with tears streaming down her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different from the confident, condescending tone he'd used earlier. I think, he said slowly, we need to take a recess. When we return, I want to hear Mrs. Rodriguez's case presented properly, with all relevant legal precedents and evidence. Maya nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Justice delayed is justice denied, but it's never too late to do the right thing. The 30-minute recess felt like the longest half-hour of Judge Harrison's career. He sat alone in his chambers, staring at the Harvard Law diploma that Maya had left behind as evidence. His hands were shaking slightly as he picked up his phone and called his clerk. Patricia, I need you to verify something for me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Look up a graduate from Harvard Law School, Maya Johnson. She would have graduated last year. While he waited, Judge Harrison caught sight of himself in the mirror behind his desk. For 30 years he had prided himself on running a fair courtroom. He had always believed he treated everyone equally, regardless of their background. But today, a 19-year-old girl had held up a mirror to his prejudices, and he didn't like what he saw. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. She's real, Judge. Not only did she graduate from Harvard, but there are news articles about her. She was featured in Legal Times magazine as one of the most promising young attorneys in civil rights law. Judge Harrison put his head in his hands. He had spent the afternoon humiliating one of the most qualified young legal minds he had ever encountered, all because she didn't look the way he expected a lawyer to look. When court resumed, the atmosphere was completely different. Maya had spent the recess working with David Chen, organizing evidence and preparing arguments. Mrs. Rodriguez sat at the plaintiff's table with renewed hope in her eyes. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom looking like a man who had aged years. In 30 minutes, he took his seat slowly, his usual commanding presence replaced by something much more humble. Before we proceed, he began, his voice noticeably quieter than before, I owe this court, and particularly Ms. Johnson and Mrs. Rodriguez, an apology. The courtroom was silent. Apologies from judges were rare, especially public ones. I allowed my assumptions and biases to cloud my judgment today, Judge Harrison continued, looking directly at Maya. I treated Ms. Johnson with disrespect based on her age and appearance without considering her qualifications or the merit of her contributions. This was wrong, and it goes against everything this court should represent. Maya nodded graciously but said nothing. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to let people's words speak for themselves. Furthermore, the judge continued, I realize that my behavior today may have compromised Mrs. Rodriguez's right to fair representation. That is unacceptable, and I intend to ensure that this case receives the thorough and unbiased hearing it deserves. He turned to David Chen. Mr. Chen, I understand that Ms. Johnson has offered to assist you with this case. Given her qualifications, which I have now verified, I'm prepared to grant her temporary permission to participate as co-counsel, if Mrs. Rodriguez consents. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up immediately. Yes, Your Honor. I would be honored to have Ms. Johnson represent me. What followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever seen. Maya, working alongside David Chen, presented a case that was both methodical and passionate. She introduced evidence that showed a clear pattern of discrimination across multiple properties. She presented statistical analysis that demonstrated how qualified minority applicants were consistently rejected, while less qualified white applicants were approved. Maya's presentation was masterful. She spoke clearly and confidently, explaining complex legal concepts in ways that everyone in the courtroom could understand. She quoted case law from memory, referenced specific sections of the Fair Housing Act, and painted a picture of systematic discrimination that was impossible to ignore. The defense attorney, who had seemed so confident earlier, was clearly overwhelmed. He had prepared for a simple case against an inexperienced public defender, not a legal battle against someone who had dedicated years to studying housing discrimination law. "Your Honor," Maya said as she concluded her arguments, "this case isn't just about Mrs. Rodriguez, though her situation certainly deserves justice. This case is about whether we as a society will tolerate discrimination or whether we will stand up and say that everyone deserves equal treatment under the law." She gestured toward Mrs. Rodriguez, who was listening intently despite the language barrier that had complicated her case from the beginning. Mrs. Rodriguez worked 2 jobs to support her family. She saved money for years to afford a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood. She has excellent credit, stable income, and spotless references. The only thing that disqualified her from housing was her last name and the color of her skin. Maya's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The evidence shows that the defendants violated federal fair housing laws not once, not twice, but repeatedly and systematically. They created a pattern of discrimination that denied housing to qualified minority applicants while approving less qualified white applicants. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, illegal discrimination." Judge Harrison listened carefully to every word. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Where he had been dismissive and impatient before, he was now attentive and respectful. When Maya finished her presentation, Judge Harrison took a long moment before speaking. "Ms. Johnson, that was one of the most thorough and compelling legal arguments I've heard in my 30 years on this bench. Mr. Chen, you're fortunate to have such capable assistants." The judge then turned to the defense attorney. "Counselor, based on the evidence presented, I'm finding in favor of the plaintiff. The pattern of discrimination is clear and undeniable. Mrs. Rodriguez is entitled to compensatory damages for the housing she was denied, punitive damages for the deliberate nature of the discrimination, and attorney's fees." The courtroom erupted in whispers and scattered applause. Mrs. Rodriguez began crying tears of joy, reaching over to hug Maya tightly. But Maya wasn't finished. "Your Honor, if I may, we'd also like to request that the court order the defendants to undergo fair housing training and to implement new policies to prevent future discrimination." Judge Harrison nodded. "Granted. Furthermore, I'm ordering a comprehensive review of the defendants' rental practices over the past 5 years. If additional victims are identified, they will be entitled to compensation as well." As the court session ended, something remarkable happened. Several attorneys who had witnessed the proceedings approached Maya to congratulate her and offer collaboration opportunities. Word was already spreading through the legal community about the young woman who had transformed a failing case into a landmark victory. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Judge Harrison asked to speak with Maya privately. "Ms. Johnson," he said when they were alone, "I owe you more than just a public apology. Today you taught me something about the danger of assumptions and the importance of keeping an open mind. I've been a judge for 3 decades, and I thought I knew what qualified representation looked like. You showed me that expertise comes in many forms." Maya smiled. "Thank you, Your Honor. We all have biases. What matters is what we do when we recognize them." "I'd like to do something," Judge Harrison said. "I want to establish a scholarship program for young lawyers from underrepresented communities. Would you be willing to help me create it?" 3 months later, Maya opened her own law practice specializing in civil rights cases. The Johnson Civil Rights Law Firm quickly gained a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning them. Maya's client list grew to include people from all walks of life who had faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education. The scholarship program that Judge Harrison had proposed became reality, providing opportunities for other young lawyers who might otherwise be overlooked because of their age, background, or appearance. Mrs. Rodriguez became one of Maya's first clients in her new practice, referring friends and family members who had faced similar discrimination. She also became something of a mentor to Maya, reminding her that the law was ultimately about helping real people with real problems. As for Judge Harrison, he underwent voluntary bias training and became an advocate for judicial reform. He often told the story of the day a 19-year-old girl taught him that wisdom and qualifications couldn't be judged by appearances alone. Maya's story spread throughout the legal community and beyond, inspiring young people everywhere to pursue their dreams regardless of what others might think about their age or background. She proved that justice truly could be blind to everything except the truth, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply refuse to be silent when you witnessed injustice. The girl who had walked into that courtroom as an observer had emerged as a force for change, transforming not just one case but an entire system's understanding of what it meant to be qualified, respected, and heard.